Mary Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale was born in 1872 in Upper Norwood, Surrey. Her father was a successful barrister, and this afforded the family an affluent middle-class life. Her early affinity for drawing and painting led to her later attendance at the nearby Crystal Palace School of Art, and she was subsequently accepted by London's highly selective Royal Academy schools. At this point her ambitions were artistic rather than illustrative, although ironically the earliest verifiable dated images I could find by her were actually monochrome pen and ink illustrations published in 1898 in The Studio, a highly respected journal of the arts at the time. A presence in this publication was considered to be a serious endorsement of the artist or illustrator's reputation, and these early illustrations gave a clear indication of her general inclination towards creating romanticised images of distant times. The same was true of the medievally themed paintings she was producing in both oils and watercolours, and the painting which really launched her art career and drew a lot of favourable attention was The Pale Complexion of True Love, exhibited for the first time in 1899. From the outset she demonstrated high levels of technical expertise, and the influence of the group of Victorian artists known collectively as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was clear to see. Fortescue Brickdale had in fact been taught at the Royal Academy by John Byam Shaw, who was old enough to have been considered at least a peripheral member of this very backward-looking group, and this had further encouraged the young Fortescue Brickdale to follow in their footsteps. As the new century began, she completed another early success, a painting titled The Deceitfulness of Riches, which also would not have looked at all out of place among the Brotherhood's works. Despite the success of these paintings, she continued to create more pen and ink drawings for the studio, but they were still only occasional deviations from what she considered to be her true calling. And in 1901 she became a member of the Royal Society of Painters in Watercolours, and a year later she was elected to the Royal Institute of Oil Painters, its first female member. In 1903 she created more evocative monochromes to illustrate some of the poetry of William Wordsworth. But Fortescue Brickdale's highest profile illustration commission of the period was undoubtedly her collection of monochromes for the verses of Alfred Lord Tennyson in 1905. As she had done earlier, she placed her actual illustrations within highly demonstrative Art Nouveau style borders, incorporating the hand-lettered title of the poem. And Tennyson's rather morose rhymes were a good fit for her own love of slightly doom-laden romance. I failed to find any definitive dates for their production, but I did find a couple of examples of stained glass windows designed by her at some point in the early years of the century. In 1906 she had another success with the painting The Uninvited Guest, which continued to blend painted prowess with melodramatic allegorical subject matter. But in 1908 she made a return to the illustration of poetry with the work of Robert Browning, who had been immensely popular, at least with the literate classes of Britain, during the 19th century. And most significantly, for the first time, her work was reproduced from watercolour originals in full colour by the increasingly widespread but still expensive offset lithographic process. This considerable undertaking was no less than 4 collections of Browning's verse, with 2 somewhat oddly published in each of 2 volumes over a 2-year period. These publications were examples of what were called gift books, which in addition to featuring full colour pages were also expensively bound with the finest materials. They were eagerly collected by the prosperous British middle classes and sold at very high prices as objects to be treasured. All these illustrations were created with flawless characterization and anatomy, and although none of the sources I used even refer to her use of life models, it's unthinkable that these illustrations could have been created without serious observational drawing. And the same was just as evidently true in her evocations of both interior and exterior scenic settings. I should point out that other than the limerick, I'm completely and happily ignorant of the pleasures to be had from reading poetry, so I'm the last person qualified to express any opinion regarding the empathy or otherwise of Fortescue Brickdale's images, and here is an example which I find as impenetrable as any foreign language. But in purely pictorial terms, they were manifestly and powerfully emotional in their appeal. And judging by the costumes, characters and scenes depicted, Browning himself seems to have been another who found inspiration in a highly fictionalised and romanticised English past, along with a taste for the wistful and forlorn. The success of these book commissions hadn't gone unnoticed, and it was as early as 1909 that Fortescue Brickdale had been approached by the management of London's highly influential and prestigious Leicester Galleries to produce a collection of 28 watercolours for an edition of Tennyson's epic poem Idylls of the King, a highly romanticised account of the legend of King Arthur. It wasn't surprising, given the detail and meticulous execution of the paintings she created for this project, that it took her the best part of 2 years to complete, especially considering the other books she had illustrated and had published during the same period. They were first exhibited for sale as originals at the gallery in 1911 and then published in book form a year later. The results were breathtaking in their totally spurious but thoroughly convincing evocation of what should have been 6th century Britain, but actually depicted the England of at least 4 centuries later. However, that appeared to not bother admirers of the verse itself or Fortescue Brickdale's visualisations. But as the whole thing was merely legend, it mattered little. When published, the illustrations were contained within decorative borders, as in this example, but as you can see, I'm showing them in the main as big as I can on screen, even if it means losing the border. But the sheer volume and fine quality of images created for this commission were as epic in nature as the verses written by Tennyson, and it is still rightly considered to be her greatest achievement as an illustrator. It's probably also worth pointing out that to maximise the quality of the full-colour images, they were actually not printed in the book itself, but were printed separately on better quality, less absorbent art paper, and pasted in by minions at the printers. This process was known as tipping in and was widespread practice with gift books and others of better than usual quality. But the sheer volume and fine quality of images created for this commission were as epic in nature as the verse as written by Tennyson, and it is still rightly considered to be her greatest achievement as an illustrator, with original copies now fetching ludicrously high prices. In 1912, the story of Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, written by William Canton, was also published with yet more typical figure-based compositions from Fortescue Brickdale. On the face of it, this was not a book destined for mainstream success, as the very subject of the work was of little more than passing interest to even the more educated in society. But I do know the book's subject devoted herself to God's work and was a generally benevolent character, and this was ably reflected in Fortescue Brickdale's beatific images. Following this prodigious outpouring, it seems she took a break from illustration for a couple of years, although she wasn't idle and did carry on painting. And in 1915 her illustrated edition of Old English Songs and Ballads was published, and this was another of her greatest and certainly most popular achievements as an illustrator of books. Despite the fact that Britain was at this point at war with Germany and serious constraints were imposed on publishing, this volume seems to have just slipped under the net, and it luckily made it into publication before more stringent limitations were placed on the publishing industry for anything other than propaganda material. Once more, the subject matter and general nostalgic essence of these traditional songs lent themselves particularly well to Fortescue Brickdale's favoured topics, and they certainly resonated with those who were less than happy with how technology was evidently turning out in the horrors of war. Once the war ended in 1918, Britain attempted to return to normal, but by this point the gift book was becoming one of many casualties brought about by the changes in society seen in the post-war years. Nevertheless, in 1919, Fortescue Brickdale published the Golden Book of Famous Women, with a large collection of bucolic scenes depicting moments from the lives of both historical and fictional female characters, to accompany poems written about each one. The book is credited only to her, so I'll go out on a limb and assume she also wrote the verses, which deliberately mimic the florid romantic tones of early poets such as Keats and of course Browning. And other than the fact that they were created with conspicuously skillful use of watercolour as opposed to oils, there really was no telling them apart from the images she continued to create as an artist, either technically or in terms of her favoured subject matter. As earlier works such as the Queen Elizabeth book had shown, there's no argument that Fortescue Brickdale had always favoured depictions of female characters in her work, both as an illustrator and an artist. And this was the perfect excuse to create yet more. And although there were more populated exceptions, many of those created were of a single figure set against a usually verdant background. In 1920 she created another of her most admired paintings, the very landscape formatted image of Leonardo da Vinci showing the prototype for his flying machine. And the viewer is invited, or more accurately compelled, to read the image from left to right and observe the exceptionally well evoked characters and their facial expressions and body language. In 1922 she broke completely with her more expected painted or tightly executed penwork for the book The Sweet and Touching Tale of Fleur and Blanchefleur, an English translation of a medieval French story. For this commission she produced a collection of charming but radically simple and conspicuously atypical line and flat colour spot illustrations, which had they not been signed and credited, it's doubtful that anyone would have recognised it as her work. And however well or otherwise it performed in terms of sales, she never returned to anything even remotely similar. In the same year she was commissioned, along with several others, to create a series of purely botanical watercolours for the book Beautiful Flowers and How to Grow Them by Horace and Walter Wright. And again, although more than competent, this appears to have been her only such commission. In 1925 two more books were published featuring Fortescue Brickdale illustrations, and both were created and printed in full colour. Carols did exactly what it promised to do, with a collection of rather solemn visual interpretations of British religious songs sung at Christmas time. She had always been a committed Christian and even donated many of her works to churches and religious charities, but whether this was an example of that I have no idea. But whatever the case, these images were guaranteed to appeal to those with a sentimentally religious outlook. The same year's book, Palgrave's Golden Treasury of Songs and Lyrics, generally returned to the illustration of more secular verse, with another collection of formally posed and composed images. And virtually all of these appear to be in praise of the same by now almost vanished bucolic and less manic mythical England that featured in all her work, whether art or illustration. And although the use of a single, usually wistful character in idyllic surroundings was a persistently popular device in her work, she did also provide the viewer with others which were more close quarter or distant, more populated images for the sake of visual variety. But whatever the charms of these images, it was clear that, like others of her generation, she had now become somewhat of an anachronism as an illustrator and particularly as an artist. In 1928 she worked on the book The Gentle Art by Dion Clayton Calthorpe, but other than this still life frontispiece, the rest were very small monochrome page decorations. And although she continued to paint at this time, the only real evidence of her work I found was this pastoral study for a never completed painting commissioned by the BBC in 1930. And in the same year she painted this, titled Angels Leading the Poor, a more than fitting swan song. And Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale died in Kensington, London in 1945 at the age of 73. Among the images I found to use in the making of this video, there were, as there frequently are, quite a few I either had no clue about or at best were educated guesses. And because of the particular similarity of her dual careers in art and illustration, I was unable to work out their function, if any, beyond simply existing. So here are some of those to conclude this video, to provide yet more evidence, if it was needed, of her enviable and underappreciated talents.